sure one you'll always remember is the night of June 10th, 1959. In that game against the Baltimore Orioles, you had 4 home runs in one game to tie a Major League record.
Changed everything sounds too big to be true, but on June 10th, 1959, Rocky Colavito made it feel real by hitting 4 straight home runs in one game. The game was played at Baltimore's Memorial Stadium. Hitters feared that park, its fences sat deep, tucked far from home plate, and long fly balls that would leave other stadiums easily often died quietly in the outfield grass there instead. Colavito did not just clear those deep fences once. He cleared them 4 times in a single 9-inning game. The Cleveland won that night 11 runs to 8 in a game fans in that ballpark would talk about for the rest of their lives. Before that night, only 2 men in the history of baseball had done what Colavito did. Bobby Lowe did it in 1894. Lou Gehrig did it in 1932. Colavito had worshipped Gehrig as a kid growing up in the Bronx, and years later he openly called this night the single greatest moment of his whole professional career. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons, and if Rocky's story already has you fired up, tap hype, and give this video some hype as we find out what he truly changed. A perfect night like that can make a player unforgettable. It can also make the rest of his career harder to judge clearly. When one night becomes larger than life, people start to build a legend around it, and once a legend forms, fans stop asking simple questions. Was Rocky Colavito truly one of the greatest players baseball ever saw? Or did one incredible night and one terrible trade that came soon after turn a very good career into something bigger than it really was? That question sits at the center of everything we are about to explore. Think about what that single night really did. The A batter stepped into one of the toughest home run parks in the country and simply refused to be stopped by it 4 separate times in a row. Stories like that do not fade with time. They grow. Every retelling adds a little more shine, and over the years, a single game can start to stand in for an entire career. That is not dishonest storytelling. It is simply how legends work. Our job here is not to tear the legend down for no reason. Our job is to look at it honestly, piece by piece, and see how much of it holds up once we compare it against the full record. Consider for a moment just how rare that night truly was. The baseball had been played professionally for the better part of a century. By the time Colavito stepped up to the plate in Baltimore, across thousands and thousands of games played by thousands of hitters, only 2 other men in the entire sport's history had ever managed 4 home runs in a row within a single contest. That kind of rarity is hard to overstate in a game built on failure, where even the greatest hitters miss far more often than they connect. Colavito joined that short, exclusive list on a single warm summer night, and the achievement followed him proudly for the rest of his life, shaping how an entire city would remember him. To understand Colavito, we have to go back before the home runs and before the fame took hold of his story. We have to go back to a kid in the Bronx who wanted nothing more than to hit exactly like his hero. That kid was not a finished product, and he certainly was not a natural in the way the legend later liked to suggest. He was raw. He needed real help from someone who could see what he could not see about his own swing. And the story of how he became great step by step tells us something important, something the legend often skips over entirely on its way to the highlight reel. Rocky Colavito grew up admiring Joe DiMaggio. Like a lot of young players, he copied what he saw on the biggest stage in baseball. DiMaggio stood deep in the batter's box with an open stance, and young Colavito tried to copy that exact look right down to the way DiMaggio held his hand. In 1953, he was playing Class A ball in Reading, still trying to be a smaller version of DiMaggio instead of the hitter he was capable of becoming. His manager, Kirby Farrell, noticed the problem right away. Farrell told him plainly that it was time to stop trying to hit like DiMaggio and start learning how to hit like himself. Farrell made real, concrete changes. He had Colavito bring his feet closer together. He moved him further forward in the batter's box, closer to the pitcher so he could see the ball a little sooner. He asked him to choke up slightly on the bat and use a small crouch instead of standing tall and open the way DiMaggio did. These were small mechanical changes on paper, but they unlocked something big inside Colavito's swing. That same season, with his new stance, Colavito led the entire Eastern League with 28 home runs and 121 runs batted in. A young hitter who had been copying someone else suddenly became the best power hitter in his own league. This detail matters more than it might seem at first. The legend of Rocky Colavito likes to paint him as a natural, a man born to crush baseballs without any real teaching involved. The truth is more interesting and honestly, more admirable. He was a talented young man who needed a coach to fix his swing before that talent could turn into real results. Power was always inside him. It took Kirby Farrell's trained eye and Colavito's own willingness to change something that felt familiar finally bring it out. Once his mechanics were fixed, Colavito built a batting routine that fans would recognize instantly, almost like a signature written in body language. language. Before every pitch, he laid his bat across his shoulders like a yoke. He stretched his core, rolling his shoulders slightly to stay loose. He pointed the barrel of the bat straight at the pitcher, almost like he was taking aim. He locked his eyes on the exact spot where the ball would leave the pitcher's hand. It was part ritual and part focus drill, and over time it became one of his most recognizable signatures, something fans in the stands could pick out from a distance before he ever swung the bat. None of this happened by accident. Colavito became a great hitter because he learned, adjusted, and worked at his craft day after day, season after season. He was not simply born great and left alone to succeed without effort. That distinction will matter later when we look closely at exactly how big his legend grew, and whether the whole story matches the full truth of a career built through effort as much as talent. By the late 1950s, that hard work had turned Colavito into one of the most feared power hitters anywhere in the entire game, a name pitchers genuinely dreaded seeing in the lineup card. In 1958, he led the American League with a slugging percentage of .620. He hit 41 home runs that year, finishing just one behind the league leader, Mickey Mantle, in what was one of the tightest home run races fans had seen in years. The next year, in 1959, he hit 42 home runs and tied Harmon Killebrew for the American League home run title outright. With that season, Colavito became the first player in Cleveland franchise history to record back-to-back seasons of 40 or more home runs, a milestone that had never once belonged to any Cleveland hitter before him in the team's history. Add those two seasons together, and the numbers become even more impressive. Across 1958 and 1959, Rocky Colavito hit 83 home runs combined. During that same two-year stretch, Mickey Mantle hit 73. Willie Mays hit 63 for those two seasons, judged purely on total home runs. Colavito outproduced two of the most legendary hitters baseball has ever known, two men whose names are still spoken with total reverence today. That is a real documented fact, and it deserves real respect. But it also deserves a careful question. 2 years is not a whole career. The Mantle and Mays built decades of dominance, filled with championships, awards, and sustained excellence at the very top of the sport year after year after year. Colavito's 2-year peak was brilliant, genuinely one of the best short stretches any power hitter has ever produced, but a peak is not the same thing as a complete body of work. The legend often treats those 83 home runs as proof that Colavito belonged in the same conversation as Mantle and Mays for his entire career. The full picture, as we will see, is more complicated than that, and we will return to it later in this story. It helps to sit with that comparison for a moment rather than rushing past it. The 2-year home run race against two of the most decorated outfielders the sport has ever produced is not a small thing to accomplish, even if it does not settle the larger question of an entire career. Some fans will hear those numbers and conclude that Colavito deserves to be mentioned in the very same breath as Mantle and Mays for all time. The others will hear the same numbers and say the comparison only works for two specific seasons, nothing more. Both reactions are reasonable. The goal here is not to force one conclusion, but to give both sides of that debate their fair due before moving forward. Colavito had his own measuring stick for greatness, and it was not himself. He often said that Ted Williams was the best hitter he had ever seen play the game. What impressed him most was not just Williams's power, but his balance and his composure at the plate. Colavito said he never once saw Williams look bad at the plate, never saw him look off balance or out of control during an at-bat, even against the toughest pitching of the day. Williams always looked like he was in charge of the moment, no matter who was on the mound. Colavito tried to bring that same sense of control into his own swing, even while chasing home runs with everything he had, swinging as hard as anyone in the league. That respect tells us something honest about Colavito, something worth remembering as this story gets more complicated. He knew the difference between a hitter who simply swung hard and a hitter who was truly complete in every part of his approach. He chased power with everything he had, but he admired command and control just as much. Keeping that difference in mind helps us judge his own career later on, with the same kind of honesty he showed toward Williams. While the bat made Colavito famous across the country, many people who watched him play up close believed his arm was the true wonder of his game. From deep in the outfield, standing near the warning track, he could throw a baseball with a kind of force that changed how other teams approached the running game entirely. The runners on second base had to think twice before trying for third, even on balls that should have been easy advances against a normal outfielder. The routine single sometimes became a cautious jog instead of an aggressive dash, because nobody wanted to test that arm and end up embarrassed at the next base. The Cleveland scout Hal Reason and farm director Mike McNally first discovered that arm at a tryout held at Yankee Stadium, of all places. The most famous ballpark in the sport, and a fitting stage for a talent that would later become so famous itself. Colavito was only 17 years old at the time, a teenager standing on the same grass where the greatest legend legends of the game had once played. The McNally signed him almost immediately, after watching a single throw sail in from the outfield grass with startling carry and force behind it. Years later, McNally said flatly that he had never seen a stronger arm anywhere in professional baseball, across an entire career spent evaluating young talent for a living. That evaluation was not just talk from a scout trying to justify a signing. In 1956, while playing in the Pacific Coast League, Colavito took part in a promotional throwing contest arranged by San Diego general manager Ralph Kiner. The slugger, who would later be elected to the Hall of Fame himself, and who knew exactly what a rare arm looked like. Standing at home plate at Lane Stadium, in front of a crowd that had gathered just to see this feat attempted, Colavito was given 3 chances to throw a baseball over the center field wall. That wall stood 435 feet away and carried a 10-foot screen on top of it, a serious obstacle for anyone throwing from a flat-footed position at home plate. Colavito cleared the wall on the fly, without the ball even grazing the screen. His official longest throw measured 435 feet and 10 inches. Kiner, who watched it happen with his own eyes, said Colavito had the single best throwing arm in all of baseball, a bold statement from a man who had seen plenty of great arms himself. Colavito later said that one of his throws that day actually traveled even farther than the recorded distance, but it struck a parked car outside the stadium and was disqualified from the official measurement. That arm did more than win promotional contests in front of an amazed crowd. It won real baseball games that actually counted in the standings, in moments that mattered far more than any exhibition. On September 24, 1955, Cleveland played Detroit in a regular season game with real stakes on the line. Detroit's Bill Tuttle hit a very deep fly ball to right field, the kind of ball that usually lets a smart base runner move up a base without much risk at all. Colavito ran it down with his back against the wall and made the catch cleanly, under control despite the difficult angle. Detroit's Earl Torgeson tagged up from second base and tried to advance to third, a play that succeeds far more often than it fails against an ordinary outfield. Colavito fired a low direct throw to third base that arrived while Torgeson was still about 30 feet from the bag, plenty of room for the defense to make the tag with ease. Torgeson was tagged out easily, a runner erased simply because Colavito's arm reached third base faster than his legs ever could carry him there. Years later, in 1961, sabermetric analysis of that season rated Colavito as the best defensive left fielder in the entire American League while he played for Detroit. He led every left fielder in the entire league in outfield assists, with 16 of them recorded that season alone. He led in total zone runs, a modern statistic that measures how many runs a fielder saves through range and positioning, rather than raw statistics like errors. He led in range factor, which measures how many successful plays a fielder makes per 9 innings on the field. He also led in putouts among left fielders that year. That season stands today as hard, measurable proof that Colavito's defense belonged in the same conversation as his hitting, not as an afterthought behind it. To understand why those defensive numbers matter so much, it helps to think about what a great outfield arm actually prevents rather than what it produces. The A hitter's numbers show up directly on the scoreboard, a home run or a double that everyone in the stadium can see and cheer for right away. The A great throwing arm often works differently, more quietly. It prevents a run before that run ever has the chance to happen by convincing a base runner not to even attempt the extra base in the first place. That kind of value rarely makes the highlight reel, because the most impressive part of the play is often the runner who simply stays put, deciding not to test the arm at all. The modern statistics like total zone runs were built specifically to capture that hidden, quiet kind of value, the kind that older box scores never could measure properly. In Detroit, Colavito played left field next to Al Kaline in right field, and together they formed one of the most talked about outfield pairings of the era. Fans and sports writers loved to argue over which man had the stronger arm, a debate that filled newspaper columns and barroom conversations across the city. Kaline was known for a quick release and pinpoint accuracy, the kind of throw that hit its target almost instantly without wasted motion. Colavito was known for something different, a raw and almost unmatched throwing power that made runners think twice before they ever left their base in the first place. Both were great. Both were feared by opposing coaches. Neither one needed to insult the other to prove his own value on the field. Colavito's arm was also compared by fans and writers of the time with other legendary outfield arms of the era, names like Roberto Clemente and Carl Furillo. The players still remembered today for the same kind of fear they created among opposing base runners on every close play at the bases. Being mentioned in that company was not a small compliment, especially for a player who had started his career known mainly as a home run hitter. It placed Colavito among a short exclusive list of outfielders outfielders whose reputation alone could change how an entire opposing lineup approached the bases. The forcing coaches to hold runners at third rather than risk sending them on a play that looked safe on paper. His precision matched his power, too, in a way that few sluggers of his era could claim. In 1965, playing back in Cleveland, Colavito became the first outfielder in American League history to play a complete 162-game season without committing a single error, finishing the year with a perfect 1.00 fielding percentage across every game on the schedule. That is not a small accomplishment for any player, let alone one known primarily for his bat. It takes remarkable focus to avoid every mistake across an entire season of chances, diving catches, tricky bounces off unpredictable outfield grass, and long throws made under pressure with runners in scoring position. If we are being honest about Colavito's whole career, his defense might actually be stronger evidence of his greatness than the famous curse story that grew up around him later. The assists, error-free seasons, and thrown-out runners are simple, countable facts that anyone can check. They curse is folklore, passed down and exaggerated with each retelling. Real defense holds up under scrutiny in a way that legend sometimes does not. Now we arrive at the moment that changed the whole shape of Colavito's story, the trade that sent him away from Cleveland for good. To understand it, we first need to understand the man who made the decision. The Cleveland general manager, Frank Lane, was famous and a little bit feared throughout the league for how often he traded players away, sometimes seemingly overnight. The over 7 years running different teams, Lane completed 242 trades, an almost unbelievable number for any front office executive in any era of the sport. He believed strongly in an older style of baseball, one built around contact hitting and putting the ball in play rather than swinging for the fences. To Lane, a strikeout was close to the worst thing a hitter could do at the plate. He simply did not value home run power the same way Colavito's fans in Cleveland did, and that gap in philosophy would eventually cost the franchise dearly. After his huge 1959 season, in which he tied for the league lead in home runs, Colavito asked Cleveland for a salary of $45,000, a number he felt honestly matched everything he had produced on the field that year. Lane refused, and instead renewed his contract at $35,000, a full $10,000 below what Colavito believed he had rightfully earned through his performance. The disagreement left both sides bitter, and it never fully healed before the next season began. On April 17, 1960, during an exhibition game in Memphis, Cleveland manager Joe Gordon walked out to first base to speak with Colavito directly in the middle of a game, without much warning. Gordon told him plainly that he had just played his last game in a Cleveland uniform. He had been traded to Detroit in exchange for Harvey Cohen, effective immediately. On paper, the trade did not look insane at first glance, and plenty of baseball people at the time defended it. Cohen had just won the 1959 American League batting title, with an average of .353, a genuinely elite number for any hitter in that era of the game. He was a legitimate star in his own right, but look closer and the numbers tell a very different story. Cohen was 29 years old, and he was already dealing with injuries in his legs that limited his range and his speed. Colavito was only 26, and he was entering the very peak of his physical prime, with his best power years likely still ahead of him. The Cleveland traded a rising superstar in his prime years for an aging star who was already showing early signs of decline, a trade of futures for past accomplishments. The trade did not prove Rocky was magical. It proved Cleveland's front office was careless. That single sentence is the true center of this whole story, the idea we keep returning to. The fans wanted a simple villain and a simple explanation for what came next, so a superstition grew instead of a fair, clear-headed explanation. The truth is less mysterious than any curse story, and honestly more frustrating to accept. It was not magic. It was bad management, plain and simple. It is worth pausing here to notice how much of this conflict came down to two different ways of valuing a baseball player, not to any personal grudge between two men. Lane had built his entire career, all 242 of those trades, around a style of baseball that prized contact and discipline over raw power. Colavito represented the opposite philosophy almost perfectly, a hitter willing to strike out plenty of times in exchange for the chance to hit the ball a very long way. Neither approach is inherently wrong. The baseball has room for both kinds of hitters and both kinds of executives. But when the two philosophies collided inside one front office, with a stubborn general manager holding all the power over a young star's contract, the result was a trade that history has judged very harshly. That mistake did not happen alone, often isolation. It sat inside a much longer pattern of poor decisions by the Cleveland front office, a pattern that turned one bad trade into decades of frustration for an entire fan base that deserved better. Let us count down through the moves that built this pattern, starting with the most recent one, and working backward to where it all began. The number 4. In 1965, Cleveland brought an aging Colavito back to the team, hoping to recapture some of the old magic that had left with him 5 years earlier. To get him back, they gave up two young players, Tommy John and Tommy Agee, both of whom still had their best baseball ahead of them. Tommy John went on to win 288 games over a long and remarkable major league career that stretched across parts of 4 decades. Tommy A.G. won Rookie of the Year and later helped the 1969 New York Mets win a championship that shocked the entire baseball world and is still remembered as one of the great underdog stories in the sport's history. The number 3. On April 17, 1960, Cleveland traded away an outfielder who had just averaged more than 40 home runs across 2 straight seasons, sending Rocky Colavito to Detroit for Harvey Quinn in the deal that would define the whole era. The researchers estimate that the move cost Cleveland more than 300 home runs that Colavito might have hit in a Cleveland uniform over the following years. Had he stayed, in the immediate aftermath, Cleveland's attendance for the 1960 season fell by 547,000 fans compared to the year before, a staggering, almost unbelievable drop for any franchise to absorb within a single year of baseball. We cannot say the trade alone caused every one of those missing fans to stay home instead of coming to the ballpark, but the timing certainly tells its own story. Number 2. Just 5 days before trading Colavito, on April 12, 1960, Cleveland traded another young player named Norm Cash to Detroit, receiving in return a player named Steve Demeter in what looked at the time like a fairly minor, unremarkable transaction. Cash went on to hit 377 home runs for Detroit over the rest of his career, becoming a beloved slugger for that franchise for many seasons to come. Demeter, meanwhile, recorded exactly 1 hit while playing for Cleveland before fading from the roster. That trade alone, coming just days before the Colavito deal, should have been a clear warning sign about the direction of the front office. Number 1. Back in June of 1958, before any of the other moves on this list ever happened, Cleveland had already traded away a young outfielder named Roger Maris, receiving Vic Power and Woody Held in return for him. Maris went on to win back-to-back Most Valuable Player awards with his new team, and in 1961 he famously hit 61 home runs in a single season, one of the most celebrated and closely watched records in the entire history of the sport. Put all of these moves together in order, and a clear pattern appears, one that is much easier to see with the benefit of hindsight than it was in the moment. Cleveland did not fall apart because it lost one magical player. The Cleveland fell apart because its front office, again and again, across a span of several years, traded away young talent that would go on to shine brightly for other teams. The Colavito trade became the most famous symbol of this pattern, the one name people remember decades later. But it was never the whole story by itself, no matter how often it gets told that way. That is why so many fans eventually gave the whole mess a nickname, the Curse of Rocky Colavito. It sounds dramatic, almost supernatural, as if one single trade placed a spell over an entire franchise for generations to come. But there was no spell, there was no curse. There was a long repeated failure to recognize and hold on to young talent before it blossomed elsewhere. Blaming a curse is simpler and honestly more comforting than blaming a series of real decisions made by real executives who had other options available to them. It gives fans one clean moment to point at, one villain and one name, instead of forcing them to sit with years of complicated, ordinary mismanagement. None of this is Rocky Colavito's fault, and none of it should be read as an attack on him or his character. He did not choose to be traded away from the city he loved. He did not control Cleveland's front office or its long-term strategy. What the Colavito trade really did was turn one very good player into a symbol, a stand-in for every mistake that came after him in the years that followed. He changed everything, not because he carried some magical power over the franchise's fortunes, but because his name became the shorthand for an entire era of bad decisions that had little to do with him personally. With the myth of the curse examined honestly piece by piece, it is worth returning to what actually made Colavito special beyond a single trade or a single night of home runs. His friendships and his personality tell us just as much about who he was as any statistic ever could. His closest friend in the game was Cleveland pitcher Herb Score. The two met back in 1953, playing together at Class A Reading, the very same season Colavito was learning his new batting stance under Kirby Farrell, two young men figuring out their futures in the same small clubhouse. They became lifelong friends almost instantly, the kind of bond that lasts long after the uniforms come off and the cheering stops. They called each other Roomie, a nickname that stuck between them for years afterward, long after either man could remember exactly how it started. During their long climb through the minor leagues together, the two young men shared a single car that cost only a few $100s between them, and by most accounts, Colavito was almost always the one behind the wheel while Score rode along beside him. They roomed together for 7 straight seasons, moving from town to town as their careers developed side by side. Colavito stood by his friend through Score's frightening eye injury in 1957 one of the toughest and most frightening moments either man faced during his career. A moment that could have ended a friendship built only on convenience but instead deepened one built on real loyalty. When Cleveland traded Colavito on April 17, 1960, the front office turned around and traded Herb Score to the Chicago White Sox the very next day, almost as if closing out an entire chapter of the team's history in the space of 24 hours. For many longtime fans, losing both men within a single day felt like losing the emotional center of the whole team at once. Two friends who had grown up together in the organization suddenly gone within hours of each other. Colavito also had strong opinions about the pitchers who gave him the hardest time at the plate. When asked who troubled him most, he pointed to Yankees left-hander Whitey Ford, a Hall of Fame pitcher known for his craftiness as much as his stuff. Colavito respected Ford's curveball, his changeup, and his deceptively tricky fastball that always seemed to arrive a fraction slower than expected. He also mentioned Ford's so-called mud ball, a pitch that catcher Elston Howard reportedly helped prepare behind the plate before handing it back to his pitcher. Facing Ford, Colavito said, demanded every single ounce of his concentration, far more than facing a pitcher who simply threw hard. Beyond hitting and fielding, Colavito even found his way onto the pitcher's mound a handful of times during his career. The results were almost too good to believe for a player who spent nearly all of his time in the outfield or at the plate. His full career pitching record stands at 1 win, no losses, and an earned run average of exactly 0 across 5 2/3 scoreless innings, facing 23 batters total over his whole career. The numbers that would be the envy of many pitchers who did nothing else for a living. In 1958, he threw 3 scoreless innings for Cleveland against Detroit, a small preview of what was to come a decade later, tucked away as little more than a footnote at the time. Then in 1968, playing for the New York Yankees near the tail end of his career, manager Ralph Houck turned to Colavito out of pure necessity. After a stretch of doubleheaders had completely worn down the regular pitching staff and left the bullpen with almost nobody fresh to call on. Facing the division-leading Detroit Tigers on August 25th, Colavito threw 2 2/3 scoreless innings, allowing only a single hit, and earned the victory and relief. A strange and unexpected line for a player everyone still thought of as an outfielder first. Later that same day, in the second game of the doubleheader, he also hit a home run off Detroit starter Mickey Lolich, turning one long afternoon into a strange and memorable showcase of everything he could still do on a baseball field. It is a wonderful story, and it deserves to be told with a smile every time it comes up, but it should also be kept in proportion rather than treated as some hidden secret about his true calling. A handful of scoreless innings, spread out over an entire career, does not make someone a hidden ace waiting to be discovered. It makes him a gifted athlete who occasionally did something remarkable in an emergency, when his team simply had nobody else available. The moment is charming precisely because it was rare, not because it revealed some secret pitching career that Cleveland or New York simply forgot to develop properly. All of this brings us to the harder part of Colavito's story, the part the legend usually skips past when fans retell it as a simple tragedy. His career declined quickly in the late 1960s. Faster than most fans expected from a player who had looked so dominant just a few years earlier, he fell short of election to the National Baseball Hall of Fame, a fact that surprises some people who only remember his peak seasons and his famous arm. His 2-year peak in 1958 and 1959 was genuinely special, matching or beating legends like Mantle and Mays in raw home run totals for that specific stretch, but it did not carry through an entire career of sustained excellence at that same towering level. That is the real difference between a Hall of Fame legend and an unforgettable local hero, a distinction that matters even though both are worth celebrating in their own way. It often comes down to how long a player can sustain his very best form, year after year, against different pitching, different ballparks, and the wear of a long career. Colavito had a spectacular prime. He had a truly historic single game, the 4-home run night in Baltimore, that opened this story. He had elite defensive value, backed up by hard statistics rather than folklore or vague memory. He had enormous cultural importance to fans across an entire region, one that lasted long after his playing days ended. What he did not have was a full career long enough, at a high enough level, to guarantee a place in Cooperstown alongside the very best of his era. Saying this out loud does not diminish him or take anything away from what he accomplished. It simply means that special is not automatically the same thing as one of the greatest complete careers baseball has ever produced. Rocky Colavito was special, without question. Whether he was one of the true all-time greats judged across a full career and not just 2 magnificent seasons is a harder and more honest question. The full record suggests the answer sits somewhere just below that highest tier in a category all its own. By the time you reach the end of a story like this one, it is worth holding 2 ideas in your mind at the same time, because both of them are true. Rocky Colavito was a remarkable player and an even better person, someone whose bat, arm, and character earned genuine respect from teammates, opponents, and fans alike. At the same time, the myth that grew up around him, the idea that one trade cursed an entire entire franchise for decades became larger than his complete career ever truly was? Both of those things can sit side by side without contradicting each other. That is not a compromise. That is simply what an honest look at the full record actually shows. And yet, none of that complexity changes how Cleveland felt about him, or how he felt about Cleveland in return. Colavito did not choose to leave the city he had grown to love. He loved it there deeply, and he said many times over the years that Cleveland was his favorite place in the world to play baseball even after everything that had happened at the trade. That love was never one-sided, and it never really faded on either side. For decades after he left, and even after he returned briefly and then left again, fans in Cleveland kept his memory alive with real, lasting affection that outlasted the disappointment of the trade itself. For many Italian-American families living through the post-war era, Colavito meant something even bigger than baseball statistics could ever capture. He became a symbol of belonging, of acceptance, and of the idea that hard work could carry a person from a modest neighborhood in the Bronx all the way to the top of professional sports, in front of the whole country watching. Like Joe DiMaggio before him, the very player he had once tried to copy as a young hitter, still learning his craft, Colavito's success gave real pride to communities that had often felt pushed to the margins of American life during that era. Communities that saw in him proof that the biggest stages in the country were not closed off to them. In August of 2021, on his 88th birthday, the city of Cleveland unveiled a permanent bronze statue of Rocky Colavito in the heart of Little Italy, a neighborhood that had claimed him as one of its own for generations. Long before any statue was ever commissioned or built, it stands there today, a lasting tribute to a player whose meaning to that community reached far beyond home run totals or box scores. The far beyond even the arm that once threw a baseball 435 feet through the air over a screen nobody thought could be cleared. So did Rocky Colavito really change everything? The way the packaging on this very video promised at the start? Not in the way the old superstition liked to claim. Not as some supernatural force controlling the fate of an entire franchise for decades on end. He did not place a curse on Cleveland, and he could not have single-handedly saved the team, even if the front office had never traded him away in the first place. But he gave the city a star it never wanted to lose in the first place, a player whose arm, whose bat, and whose loyalty became woven permanently into Cleveland's own sense of identity. That is why, even decades later, long after the trade, long after his playing days had ended completely, people still say he changed everything.